Behind every great fortune lies a great crime, or as the Spanish playwright Lope de Vega put it, the shadow of a powerful man, noble in lineage, covers 1,000 crimes. In today's case, 1,000 crimes might be an understatement. A man from the Balearic island of Mallorca with an exceptional talent for mental math, a smuggler of tobacco and weapons who sold to both sides of a war, the last pirate of the Mediterranean, the great financier of Franco in the Spanish Civil War, a womanizer, and a ruthless gangster. Juan March Ordinas was all this and more. I'm David Cott, host of New History of Spain, and today I'm launching a 5-episode series about the extraordinary life of the man who became the richest in Spain and one of the richest in the world between the 1920s and his death in 1962. Through his story, you'll learn a great deal about the world he lived in, so subscribe to not miss new episodes of this series. In this episode, we will explore his rise from youth up to World War I. In 1880, Juan March Ordinas was born, better known by his Spanishized name, though it's said that his Spanish-speaking skills were quite limited compared to his native Catalan. Contrary to some legends that sought to magnify his legacy, Juan wasn't born into poverty. His family was one of the wealthiest in Santa Margalida, a Mallorcan town of about 3,400 people at the time. His grandfather, father, and uncle ran Marc Hermanos, the island's leading exporter of pigs and garlic. They also dealt heavily in flour, bitter almonds, figs, and liquor, the latter without proper licenses, which sometimes led to fines. His relatives were already used to traveling off the island for business, as many of their products ended up in ports like Barcelona, Valencia, or the French region of Provence. In Santa Margalida, many boys earned a pittance tending free-range or farm-raised pigs, but Juan March never had to do such work. He was always among those who gave orders and profited from others' labor. His father and uncle entered local politics through the Liberal Party, serving as councilmen and mayors, a sign of the rising power of the merchant class over the old landowning elites. From them, Juan learned how politics worked in those days, and more broadly, how to bend others' wills. By buying boats with sacks of flour, pastries, or cigars, by threatening producers with rock-bottom prices, or by sparing a family son from military service. From a young age, Juan showed remarkable intelligence, especially in math. He could perform currency changes and complex calculations in his head with ease. But he also showed a reckless sexual drive. On one occasion, he tried to assault a girl, who escaped and told one of the teachers, leading to his expulsion from school. After the incident, his father sent him to the town of Alcúdia to apprentice under Antoni Mariaqués, a future business partner. When he returned home, his father entrusted him with the books of Marc Hermanos, recognizing his talent with numbers. But the greedy Juan stole 1,500 pesetas at a time when a farm worker earned about 2 pesetas a day, and his father beat him to teach him that family is never to be stolen from. As an adult, Juan had a cold and nearly non-existent relationship with his father. His mother had died when he was just 7. He learned the family business by traveling across Mallorca to find the best pigs at the lowest prices, gaining not just business experience but also a deep understanding of the island's society. From these early experiences, he absorbed the fundamental golden rule of business: buy cheap, sell high. But Juan didn't just want to inherit the family business, he dreamed of getting truly rich. That's why in 1902 he convinced his father and uncle to get involved in the lucrative business of smuggling. Smuggling had a long history in Mallorca, and the geography of Santa Margalida made it particularly well suited for this kind of activity. It was a well-organized business. There were those who provided the capital, captains and overseers who enforced orders, sailors, laborers to unload the illegal goods, and lookouts, who were sometimes shepherds or hunters as a primary profession. The carabineers, or customs police, usually of humble origins and not native to Mallorca, were responsible for preventing and cracking down on smuggling, and were deeply disliked. Smuggling was not socially condemned, and often provided extra income that, for many, meant the difference between survival and starvation. This ensured a general sense of solidarity among the population and a refusal to cooperate with the authorities. Sometimes vendettas between smugglers ended in murder, often disguised as accidents. But no one ever spoke up. A code of silence prevailed, much like the Italian mafia. The most trafficked product was tobacco. Tobacco consumption surged between the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The Compañía Arrendataria de Tabacos, a mixed public-private company, held a monopoly on tobacco sales in Spain and had the authority to pursue smuggling vessels, but its management was highly ineffective. Before the 1920s, they took advantage of their monopoly to supply poor-quality tobacco and failed to modernize cigarette production. For that reason, smugglers weren't looked down on. They brought in cheaper, higher-quality tobacco than what was sold officially. Juan had educated himself on how the smuggling world worked by speaking with older men and active smugglers. He studied every aspect of the business, from financing and smuggling codes of honor to how to bribe carabineers, and put that knowledge into practice to make money. He started smuggling by hiring a fisherman who was already running tobacco from Algeria. In French Algeria, at that time, there were more Spaniards than French, almost 200,000, mostly from Valencia and the Balearic Islands. So these trade routes were natural extensions of existing migration and commerce. But Juan wasn't satisfied with the small-time informal networks smuggling minor amounts of Algerian tobacco. He wanted to do it big. And to do that, he needed corruption, Marx's greatest weapon, according to the Spanish socialist politician Indalecio Prieto. He needed to bribe politicians and law enforcement officials tasked with stopping smuggling. In his earliest smuggling ledgers, there are already records of payments to sergeants and carabineers. Smugglers also spread propaganda among the population, portraying themselves as merely fighting against the unjust monopoly of the Compañía Arrendataria de Tabacos. Soon, Juan left behind the family pig trade and became a well-known smuggler. Just 2 years into the business, the tobacco monopoly was already aware of him. The smuggler's modus operandi was to legally load tobacco in Oran or Algiers onto ships flying French, British, or other foreign flags, with declared destinations like Malta, Italy, or other countries. At night, in open sea, they will meet up with local fishing boats and transfer the cargo. The legal ship will then return to French colonial ports and claim to customs they had lost their cargo in a storm. Naturally, this scheme involved the complicity of many French officials, just as in Spain. Before I continue, remember to subscribe if you are new. More episodes on Juan March are coming soon. And you can support my work on Patreon. Driven by his ambition to control the entire value chain, March brought a tobacco factory in Oran in 1904. The Garau family, also from Santa Margalida, owned a tobacco factory in Algiers that was the main supplier for Balearic smugglers. The Garaus initially refused to partner with Juan March, so he paid off the carabineers to crack down on their smuggling operations, effectively putting them out of business. One of the Garau workers was even killed by the carabineers. That's how far Juan March was willing to go. To put an end to the conflict, in 1909, the Garau patriarch signed a contract with March to become equal partners in the Algiers tobacco factory and its smuggling operations. But not everything went smoothly for March in those years. In 1909, the carabineers arrested several smugglers working for him and seized their cargo. In response, March, by then the biggest smuggler on the island, organized and incited a riot in Santa Margalida. The uprising succeeded in recovering the seized goods and freeing the arrested men. This bold move earned him a strong reputation among smugglers as someone who fearlessly stood up to the authorities to defend his interests. As a result, a judge issued a warrant for his arrest, but Juan fled to Algiers. From there, he bribed key witnesses such as the lieutenant he had threatened to kill during the riot, into retracting their statements, and ultimately avoided prosecution. Tobacco smuggling wasn't the only pillar of Juan March's wealth. As Mallorca's population grew, there was a rush among day laborers to become landowners, even if the plots were small and not yet suitable for farming. At the same time, many members of the nobility, unable to adapt to the new capitalist world, were experiencing liquidity crises and living unsustainable lifestyles. March took advantage of both situations, and starting in 1903, he began buying up real estate from desperate nobles at rock-bottom prices, sometimes even stripping them of all of their holdings. To carry out these real estate transactions, Juan March began conducting unofficial banking activities. He did this from a formerly aristocratic home in the center of Santa Margalida, which his father had given him as a wedding gift in 1905. This embryonic version of Banca Marc lent money to indebted nobles who in return handed over their properties. Marc will then resell those properties to day laborers and small farmers on installment plans. Large noble estates were broken up and parceled out to farming families, who often grew crops for export, which were more profitable than cereals. Marc began these operations on his native island and later expanded them primarily throughout Valencia, Castilla-La Mancha, Andalusia, and Extremadura. By 1931, he had completed over 40,000 property sales, making this one of the most solid foundations of his fortune. But as lucrative as tobacco smuggling and agricultural real estate may have been, Juan March wouldn't have become one of the 10 richest men in the world without profiting massively from the colonial war in Morocco, both world wars, and the Spanish Civil War. The Mallorcan capitalist was truly a merchant of death. Let's begin with his ventures in Morocco. In 1911, Juan March wanted to take things a step further and expand his smuggling operations under the cover of legality. A French company had been granted a monopoly to sell in Morocco tobacco and kief, which is a type of cannabis resin. The economic outlook for exploiting this business in Spanish and French Morocco was unpromising, especially since it was still an unstable region under contested colonial control. March submitted an offer to purchase the company, but at first the French executives were hesitant. However, the smuggler was known for his determination and refusal to take no for an answer. He used corruption, bribing politicians and company directors, leveraging the influence of the Count of Romanones with the French government, and issuing threats that if he didn't get the concession, he would flood Morocco with his contraband tobacco. His mafia-style tactics worked. Juan March secured a sublease of the monopoly, not so much for the Moroccan domestic market, but rather to provide legal cover for his smuggling operations and expand their reach. He set up retail outlets on the outskirts of Ceuta and Melilla, Spanish cities excluded from the monopoly, to sell smuggled tobacco produced in Algeria. From there, the tobacco was transported to mainland Spain, in direct competition with the Compañía Arrendataria de Tabacos. The sublease contract was set to expire in 1921, and the French were unwilling to renew it, especially given Marx's behavior toward France during World War I. As we will see in the next episode, by that year, the Spanish government had declared war on his smuggling empire, so the last thing March needed was to lose the concession. Desperate, he turned to King Alfonso XIII's confessor, who had strong ties with politicians and clergy in Paris. March promised the confessor a 2% stake in the business, but never paid a dime. Years later, in 1945, when the confessor was elderly and in financial need, he wrote March a letter requesting money in return for past favors. March didn't even bother to reply, showing, once again, the kind of man he was. Through his influence and additional bribes to powerful figures, he managed to get the contract renewed for another 10 years. The war in Spanish Morocco intensified between the late 1910s and early 1920s. With more Spanish troops deployed, the demand for March's contraband tobacco surged. He also profited from transporting troops and supplies for the Spanish army using his shipping company. But at the same time, Juan March was one of the primary arms suppliers to Abdelkrim, the most prominent leader of the resistance against Spanish colonialism in the Rif. After all, if there is money to be made on both sides, why settle for just one? This was a clear example of Marx's unscrupulous nature, loyal only to his financial interests. Like any true capitalist, he had no homeland. During World War I, Juan March also played both sides, and it was then that he began trafficking arms. By 1914, he was already the head of a large organization that he ruled with an iron fist. He had significant capital, influential contacts among politicians, military officials, and civil servants, and a fleet of around 200 ships, both legal and for smuggling. This made the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire all seek his cooperation. Naval and finance ministers were talking about him, proof of Marx's meteoric rise when he was still only in his 30s. Throughout the Great War, he supported the Central Powers more than the Allies, especially at the beginning, as he believed a German victory was more likely. For example, he helped repatriate Germans from the Balearic Islands to Germany by taking them to Sardinia. In French Morocco, hostility among Berber tribes was rekindled due to German instigation. The Germans supplied the Berbers with weapons, ammunition, and money, and they did all through Juan March. German submarines feared across the Mediterranean refueled on the island of Cabrera or off the coast of Girona, all courtesy of March. The British needed to patrol the Mallorcan coast just to reassure themselves, wrongly, that March wasn't helping the Germans, and the French were on the verge of taking action against him. He narrowly avoided this by acting like a rat and agreeing to provide valuable military intelligence on the movements of German submarines. The head of British intelligence in Gibraltar even bragged that March was his pirate. March took huge risks, and more than once he nearly blew up his own operation. But he came out ahead thanks to a mix of luck and an uncanny ability to navigate the treacherous waters he himself had entered. Just to give you an idea of how he operated, March would charter ships, insure their cargo through a British company for far more than it was actually worth, and then tip off the Germans to torpedo his own ships. Many of March's smuggling vessels were registered in Gibraltar and therefore flew the British flag, so the Germans considered them enemy ships. The German submarine captain would warn the crew to abandon ship, then sink it. Through this devious scheme, March profited from both ends, collecting the insurance money and maintaining the trust of the Germans. During the war years, Juan March made extraordinary profits, which allowed him to further diversify his income sources. He became one of the main shareholders of Crédito Balear, the island's leading bank, as well as the Mallorca Tramway Company. He also became the majority shareholder in La Isleña, which held a concession for transporting people and mail between the Balearic Islands, mainland Spain, Algeria, and Marseille. With that, he consolidated his maritime empire, becoming the undisputed king of Balearic shipping. But he didn't stop there. In 1916, the Trans-Mediterranean Shipping Company was formed through a merger of various Valencian and Catalan companies, with the goal of eliminating redundant routes and monopolizing passenger maritime transport. March wanted in on the consolidation process. In early 1918, he sold his shares in the Balearic Shipping Company to Trans-Mediterranea to facilitate a merger and become a shareholder in the new entity. This move sparked a smear campaign by rivals who demanded that La Isleña remain genuinely Mallorcan. Trans-Mediterranea, meanwhile, secured government concessions for key routes between Andalusia, the Canary Islands, Ceuta, and Melilla, including contracts for transporting troops and military supplies. In addition to supplying fuel, weapons, and military intelligence, Juan March also provided food to the belligerent nations during World War I. He imported wheat from Argentina to re-export it, and he also exported food produced in Mallorca, since countries at war were paying much higher prices. But while March was getting rich, his actions caused food shortages and inflation in Mallorca, which hit city dwellers especially hard. It wasn't the first, nor the last time, that capitalist logic led to hunger in a country that produced food. Due to public protests, the Spanish Parliament passed the Subsistence law in 1915 to set price limits for essential goods and prohibit their export. However, March had no intention of complying with the law. You don't amass a fortune like his by playing by the rules and being honest. It was during World War I that Spain's biggest smuggler began to decisively influence Spanish politics, including in Madrid, to protect his economic interests. The Mallorcan knew that politics and business had to go hand in hand if you wanted to succeed in a big way. So, he joined the Liberal Party, started spending time in Madrid, and befriended the Count of Romanones, who was then Prime Minister. Together they attempted to create a free trade zone in Palma de Mallorca. March had politicians in his pocket. The most prominent was Santiago Alba, a liberal politician and Minister of Finance. Alba was so shameless that he would sign decrees banning the export of certain goods, only to then grant special permits to Juan March's companies, allowing them to export so-called surplus products that the local market supposedly couldn't absorb. Alba's daughter once said that Spain didn't deserve politicians like her father. Journalist Josep Pla wrote, quote, "In the capital, if you put an envelope full of money on the table, they take it and put it in the drawer, just like Santiago Alba always did." End quote. Still, not all politicians of the Bourbon Restoration era were corrupt. Senator Manuel Allende Salazar publicly denounced Juan March during a parliamentary debate. He stated that everything enriching the tax evader is paid for by the honest taxpayer, and that it was a disgrace to protect the biggest smuggler in Spain. By 1918, the subsistence crisis had worsened in Mallorca, and Juan March knew that it could lead to a social upheaval with unpredictable consequences. So, he met with local socialist leaders to discuss how best to invest part of his wartime profits to improve workers' conditions. They eventually decided to build a Casa del Pueblo, an office of the Socialist Party and their union, where workers could gather and get educated. It was the typical gesture of charitable cynicism from the wealthy to whitewash their image. March declared that the building should be constructed on municipal land, sparking a heated debate in the city council because the mayor had not been informed. Since the conservatives held the majority and were enemies of the smuggler, the construction was not approved, triggering unrest. With this maneuver, March positioned himself as a modern capitalist detached from the aristocratic and monarchical right-wing establishment, someone who could make deals with workers' organizations. As an alternative, March offered to pay monthly rent for a workers' meeting space. This allowed him to keep dissent under control and silence protests against the food exports that were harming Mallorcan workers. Republicans and anarchists denounced this relationship of dependence. One newspaper sarcastically said that workers had become monarchists in the service of the tobacco king. Juan March understood the importance of the press and the workers' movement. He published a letter in a local newspaper trying to refute accusations that he was hoarding food and responsible for the shortages. With psychopathic cynicism, he painted himself as the victim. It was as if he were anticipating something inevitable. Just days later, a spontaneous uprising of women and children broke out over the soaring prices of food and coal for the winter. But the Socialist Party and some labor organizations insisted that March was the only capitalist who had shown any concern for the working class. With that, the Pirate of Mallorca had already reaped the rewards of his generosity. In February 1919, another uprising occurred, but this time the starving crowd headed to the port, knowing food would be stored there, and unleashed their fury on Juan March and his business partner Antoni Mariaqués. Soldiers had to protect the residents of the Great Smuggler. For an entire day, the masses took over Palma de Mallorca and surrounding areas until the civil guard and army managed to suppress the revolt and restore order. Anarchists harshly criticized the socialist leader from Mallorca who had tried to calm tensions in defense of the bourgeoisie. With their wealth, social status, and even their lives at risk, the ruling class was terrified. An emergency session was held at Palma's City Hall, where conservatives blamed hoarders and smugglers, especially March, for the crisis. However, the local socialist leader continued to defend March and tried to pin the blame on Antoni Mariaqués, as if he didn't know they were partners. The move backfired. Privately, another socialist admitted that Juan was a hoarder, but said they couldn't go against the man who had donated money for the temporary Casa del Pueblo. March rewarded these same socialists with a management job at a factory. The corruption and reformist leanings of Marxist socialism were on full display, as they often were. The promised Casa del Pueblo in Palma wasn't completed until 1924, 6 years later. When it was inaugurated, March gave a speech presenting himself as a self-made man, a former laborer who had become a modern capitalist committed to society. All lies! He said this without the slightest shame, even though he was the man behind the subsistence crisis that had starved the poor just a few years earlier. And the socialist workers applauded him. Socialist leader Indalecio Prieto rejected March's invitation to the event, saying it was wrong for a bourgeois to fund the Casa del Pueblo. Mallorcan anarchists consistently criticized March for it, and eventually refused to participate in the gatherings of the Casa del Pueblo. That's not to say all anarchists were incorruptible. Some did work for March during the Second Spanish Republic. In this first episode on the biography of Juan March Ordinas, we've covered his youth, how he got rich through tobacco and arms smuggling, his banking ventures, real estate deals, and shipping empire, all fueled by corruption at the highest political levels. In the next episode, we'll dive into the story of a murder ordered by Juan March, his early industrial ventures, and how the state tried to bring down his empire. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, share your first impressions of the Mallorcan capitalist in the comments, and spread his story on social media. This research takes a lot of work, so consider supporting me on patreon.com/newhistoryspain or with a donation. Links are in the description. Thanks for listening and see you next time!